So the experimental proofs offered by Spiritists.
Guénon finds them completely unconvincing, based on phenomena that can be explained differently and resting on shaky philosophical ground.
And the actual descriptions of the afterlife coming through. Guenon wasn't impressed, was he?
No, he found them incredibly simplistic and, frankly, quite mundane, often just projections of earthly life.
Like Kardec's descriptions.
Yes, Kardec talks about a state of trouble right after death, basic confusion, and then spirits settling into a daily life that sounds remarkably, well, earthly. He notes similar themes in theosophical descriptions, too, supposedly based on clairvoyance.
And the accounts of other planets were particularly singled out.
Oh, absolutely. He found those utterly absurd, contradictory descriptions of Jupiter, Mercury, things like glass houses, ridiculously tall rice stalks. It just screamed human fantasy, not extraterrestrial reality.
What about things like gender? Did spirits keep their earthly gender?
Spiritists couldn't even agree on that. Conflicting messages came through, and their cosmology, this hierarchy of planets with advanced beings on Jupiter, the sun is some kind of spiritual hub. Guénon saw it all as very simplistic, very anthropocentric.
Limited by human concepts again.
Constantly. The spiritual insights seemed stuck firmly within the bounds of 19th century imagination.
So from Guénon's metaphysical standpoint, is communication with the dead, as Spiritists conceive it, even possible?
His view is that genuine communication requires a certain resonance. Either the living person needs to be in a similar state of being or elevated to a level where connection is possible.
Like in certain mystical states.
Perhaps. He allows for communication with beings in states that are still, in some sense, prolongations of the individual human condition. But communicating with beings in fundamentally different states of existence, he sees that as practically impossible without some higher unifying principle bridging the gap.
And communicating with someone who has achieved true, absolute immortality.
Well, Guénon argues that to do that, the living person would essentially have to realize their own transcendent nature, their true self. At which point the whole concept of communication, as Spiritists understand it, becomes kind of meaningless. You're not talking to an external entity in the same way.
Okay. What about reincarnation? Another huge belief for many Spiritists, though not all. Guénon's take.
He's blunt. He calls it an absurdity.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Strong words.
Very. He notes it wasn't even universal in early Spiritism. Many American and British spiritualists rejected it initially. It was more central to Kardec's French school.
How does he deal with arguments for it, like biblical passages?
He looks at things like the Elijah John the Baptist connection, which reincarnationists often cite, and offers interpretations based on transmission of spiritual influence or function, not the same soul inhabiting a new body.
And the more elaborate occultist theories. Papus, for instance.
Oh, he dismisses Pappus's ideas as pure fantasy. These cycles of great figures like Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon being reincarnated from the apartment of the invisible, or saints coming from the apartment of the Virgin of Light.
Sounds colorful.
Extremely. Guénon sees no logical or traditional basis for it. He also critiques Pappus's attempts to explain biblical verses by suggesting reincarnation before death or through one's descendants.
What's Guénon's alternative for explaining family traits, then?
He suggests that something like hereditary responsibility, the passing down of tendencies and potentials through lineage, makes far more sense than individual souls hopping between bodies.
Guénon was also deeply skeptical of applying scientific methods to these areas, right? Like trying to prove past lives through memory regression.
Absolutely. He saw it as a fundamental category error, trying to use empirical methods to investigate metaphysical questions.
He uses that mathematical example, Breton's idea.
Yeah, Breton's game about reversing velocities. Guénon shows how taking that mathematical abstraction and trying to apply it literally to time reversal and memory is just flawed logic.
Because time doesn't actually run backwards.
Exactly. Change is irreversible in the real world, both for living things and even in organic matter. So the idea of literally retrieving memories from a past life through some kind of mental time travel is, for Guénon, impossible.
So what is happening in those hypnotic regression sessions?
He puts it down largely to suggestion and imagination. The subject, guided by the hypnotist, essentially constructs a narrative, a kind of mental reality, based on suggestion, latent memories, fantasies. But it doesn't correspond to an actual past existence.
Right. Another big theme Guénon tackles is Spiritism's embrace of progress and evolution.
Yes, Spiritism really jumped on the Victorian bandwagon of progress, applied it wholesale to the spirit world.
Kardec again?
Kardec's teachings are full of it, spirits evolving, moving up through different orders from inferior to superior, through progressive transmigration, becoming purer, their paraspirit bodies becoming more refined.
And beings in superior worlds were supposedly highly evolved.
Right. Spiritists often saw their own movement as a key part of humanity's progress, fighting materialism, promoting solidarity, ushering in a new age.
How did Guénon react to this spiritualized evolutionism?
With deep skepticism. He was highly critical of the whole modern ideology of progress anyway, arguing that intellectually the West had actually regressed since the Middle Ages. He saw moral progress as subjective and debatable.
So applying it to spirits was just compounding the error.
Pretty much. He looked at ideas like Leon Denis's evolution of the paraspirit, which borrowed heavily from contemporary science and pseudoscience, and saw it as just layering modern misconceptions onto flawed spiritist doctrine, even their cosmology, with an evolving God, totally at odds with traditional metaphysics.
It really shows how Spiritism was a product of its time.
Absolutely. Deeply embedded in 19th century assumptions.
Now, Guénon takes a darker turn when he talks about the influences behind Spiritism. He mentions the dark satellite or the sphere of the Antichrist. That sounds pretty serious.
It does. He suggests that Spiritism and movements like it are susceptible to influences from, well, let's call it the counter-tradition, forces opposed to genuine spirituality.
He means literal devil worship.
Not necessarily conscious Satanism, which he thought was rare. He saw the danger more as unconscious deviation, people thinking they're contacting benevolent spirits or achieving enlightenment, but actually opening themselves up to deceptive or dissolving influences. The influence is more symbolic, a drift towards illusion and inversion.
So, not necessarily pointy tails and pitchforks, but something more subtle working against genuine spiritual paths.
Exactly. He distinguishes it from Luciferianism, too, which he saw as incompatible with Spiritism anyway.
Right.
The real danger, he felt, was participants being completely unaware of what they were tapping into.
He mentions scandals involving Spiritist leaders.
Yes, he points to figures like Le Clément de Saint-Marc and his controversial, anti-religious, sometimes sexually suggestive propaganda, and the links between some Spiritist circles and other subversive ideologies of the time, like fraternism or calls for free union.
It's suggesting a kind of moral and spiritual disorientation.
That's the implication. Guénon concludes that section with the famous line about the supreme craft of the devil being to convince us he doesn't exist, suggesting these negative influences operate best when unrecognized.
The movement also had its share of seers and healers, didn't it?
Oh yes, very prominent. Seers producing prophecies and revelations.
Which Guénon found reliable.
Often the opposite. He gives examples like Mam Grange or Salem Hermes, whose predictions frequently turned out to be false or just plain bizarre.
And the healers?
Yeah.
What about the connection to magnetism?
Guénon discusses the link spiritists made between healing and fluids, often connected to mesmerism or magnetism. He was pretty skeptical about the efficacy of magnetism itself, and found the idea of spirits directly intervening to heal people to be absurd, fitting his broader critique.
What motivated these healers, in his view?
Often he saw it driven by a kind of vague humanistic moralism, a desire to do good, relieve suffering, promote spiritism as the key to universal happiness. He mentions the fraternists in this context.
And these healing practices often blended with other systems.
Yes. He points to overlaps or parallels with things like Christian Science, mental science, and particularly examines Father Antoine and Antoinism in Belgium.
What was notable about Father Antoine?
Guénon highlights Antoine's belief that imagination causes all illness, his rejection of doctors, his strange collective operations for healing, and his revelations, which sounded very much like typical Spiritist communications, along with some very odd theories about divine laws and reincarnation. It was another example, for Guénon, of the strange blend of ideas within these fringe movements.
Given all this, it's maybe not surprising that Spiritists were big on spreading the word. Propaganda.
Extremely. Guénon links this strong propagandist drive to their moralist impulse. They believed they had the key to happiness and progress and wanted everyone to know. This contrasts sharply, he notes, with the deliberate exclusivity of genuine esoteric traditions.
How do they spread the message?
He compares their methods to Protestant sects, public meetings, pamphlets appealing to emotion and supposed universal consent, which he dismisses as a logically flawed argument.
Who were they targeting?
All sorts of people, but Guénon particularly notes their appeal to the half-educated people with some learning but lacking deep critical thinking or philosophical grounding. He even mentions proposals for special asylums for mediums, which raises alarm bells for him about promoting mental instability.
And they definitely tapped into people's grief and suffering.
Hugely. The promise of communicating with deceased loved ones was obviously a massive draw, and the healers offered cures for physical ailments. It was a potent combination for people in distress.
He mentions W.T. Stead's Julia Biro.
Yes, as a prime example of the Anglo-Saxon pseudo-religious approach. Stead set it up explicitly to facilitate communication between the living and the dead, acting almost like a spiritual post office.
So Spiritism had this dual appeal, sometimes pseudo-religious, sometimes pseudo-scientific.
Exactly. It could adapt its presentation. Sometimes it even disguised itself as objective psychical research. Guénon quotes Albert René, advising Spiritists to adopt a broader neo-spiritualist label to seem more respectable and inclusive.
This all sounds quite critical. Finally, Guénon explicitly warns about the dangers. What kinds did he identify?
He breaks them down into 3 categories: physical, psychic, and intellectual.
Physical dangers.
Things like accidents during seances, fires, falls. Dr. Gibier reported cases. Also, potential negative health impacts on mediums and sitters, especially on the nervous system from the strain or the energies involved.
Okay. And psychic dangers.
He saw these as much more serious and common. Risks of mental imbalance, obsession by entities, whatever their true nature, developing criminal impulses, psychological dissociation, various manias, even outright possession in extreme cases.
Serious stuff. And intellectual dangers.
For Guénon, this was perhaps the most fundamental danger. The core ideas of Spiritism are simply false. Believing them leads you down a wrong path, away from genuine understanding. He saw it contributing to a breakdown of clear thinking, a disintegration of the individual's inner coherence.
A kind of contagious folly, as you put it.
Precisely. He saw it as intellectually and spiritually damaging and easily spread.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Guénon's analysis, his verdict is pretty damning.
Absolutely. He portrays Spiritism as this uniquely modern phenomenon, born from specific historical circumstances, built on flawed theories, ignoring traditional wisdom, and carrying significant risks, physical, mental, and intellectual.
He really saw it as a symptom of a modern mindset prone to certain kinds of illusion, a turning away from deeper truths.
Exactly. His critique offers some surprising insights into what he perceived as the vulnerabilities of the modern psyche, the dangers of being fascinated by phenomena without a solid framework, of mistaking sentimentality or psychic occurrences for genuine spirituality.
It certainly gives you a different perspective. And maybe leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
Go on.
Well, why did Spiritism have such appeal? Why does fascination with these kinds of phenomena persist, maybe just in new forms today?
Yeah.
And how does Guénon's warning about the scientific spirit, the uncritical embrace of the extraordinary, resonate now in our age of instant information and, frankly, constant online weirdness?
That's a very relevant question to reflect on. What drives that fascination, and what are the risks Guénon warned about today? Definitely food for thought.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.